News Talk on Samar News, your go-to podcast for the latest headlines and in-depth discussions. Join us as we unravel the stories that matter most, bringing you insightful commentary and expert analysis. Tune in for thought-provoking conversations that spark dialogue and inspire action. Stay connected with the news that shapes our world, only on News Talk on Samar News.
Okay, if you've been trying to keep up with the news, especially from the Middle East, it's just been relentless, hasn't it? So much happening so fast.
It really has. Just a constant stream of updates.
Exactly. And it's really tough sometimes to get beyond the headlines to figure out what's really going on underneath.
Yeah, the deeper implications.
So that's what we're doing today. We're taking a deep dive into something huge, the recent U.S. military strikes on Iranian nuclear sites.
A really critical event.
Our mission here is pretty simple. Cut through all that noise. We've gathered news reports, official statements, expert analysis, all of it. We want to get to the core of what happened.
What weapons were involved?
Right. The weapons, the impact, and the claims about the impact are, well, wildly different. And, of course, the potential consequences, which are huge. We just want to give you the key info, the important stuff, so you feel properly informed, not just, buried in headlines.
And this situation, it really needs that kind of close look.
You see?
Because you've got these conflicting stories coming from different sides, and the stakes, they're incredibly high.
Mm-hmm.
So a deep dive like this helps us and helps you understand not just the what happened, but the why. Why does it matter? What questions does this raise?
Okay, so let's unpack it. Where did this all start? The first word really came from U.S. President Donald Trump himself, didn't it?
Yeah, on Truth Social. He announced the bombing of 3 Iranian nuclear sites, called it a very successful attack.
And the timing. This was Sunday, June 22nd.
That's right.
And this U.S. action, it essentially means Washington jumped into the conflict that Israel was already having with Iran. That whole thing had ramped up massively just before, right, June 13th.
Yeah, that's when Israel launched those unprecedented attacks targeting Iranian nuclear sites, military commanders. It was already a major escalation.
And we have to mention the human cost even before the U.S. got involved.
Absolutely. We're talking over 400 people killed in Iran from the Israeli strikes. And then Tehran retaliated, killing at least 24 in Israel.
It's just staggering.
It really is.
Yeah.
And, it brings up these immediate fears of this spiraling out of control. Reminds people unsettlingly of the lead up to the 2003 Iraq invasion.
So beyond just the fact of the strikes, Trump's own description in his televised address was dramatic.
Extremely. Spectacular military success, he called it.
And he said Iran's key facilities were completely and totally obliterated. The stated goal, destruction of Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity. Very clear language.
Unambiguous.
So with claims like that, let's get specific. What were these 3 sites? Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. What do we know about Fordo?
Okay, Fordo. This is one that's famously hard to get to. It's a uranium enrichment facility, but it's buried deep underground. Hundreds of meters deep, apparently, near the city of Qom.
Built into a mountain, basically.
Pretty much. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, says it could hold nearly 3,000 centrifuges. And crucially, those earlier Israeli strikes, they hadn't managed to destroy Fordo. It was too deep.
Which makes the U.S. using specific weapons there really significant.
Exactly. Then you have Natanz.
Right, that's the big one.
It's Iran's largest enrichment complex. Huge centrifuge halls, some underground, too. It's been a central part of their program for years, and, it's been hit before. Sabotage attempts, the Israeli strikes on June 13th. It's a known target.
Okay, and the third one is Isfahan.
Isfahan is more about research and production. It has a facility to convert uranium, plants to make fuel. It's critical for preparing the raw materials needed for enrichment or for reactors.
Got it. So 3 key nodes in their program.
Definitely. And you have to remember the backdrop here. For years, the U.S. and Israel have accused Iran of secretly pursuing nuclear weapons. Iran consistently says, nope, it's purely civilian energy research.
Right.
Even the IAEA chief, Rafael Grossi, he's pushed back on claims Iran was, days away from a bomb. But he has expressed concerns, particularly about them enriching uranium up to 60% purity. That's quite high, not weapons grade, but closer.
And that increase in enrichment that came after the U.S. pulled out of the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, back in 2018.
That's the context, yeah. Trump pulled the U.S. out, reimposed sanctions, and Iran responded by ramping up its nuclear activities beyond the deal's limits.
So Trump announces these massive precision strikes. The details on how massive came later. Let's dig into the hardware. What weapons did the U.S. actually use?
Well, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and Air Force Chief Dan Kane gave some specifics. They talked about 14 bunker buster bombs.
The famous bunker busters.
Right, specifically dropped on Fordo and Natanz, the underground or partially underground sites. And they mentioned the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, the MOP.
MOP, that sounds serious.
It is serious. It's basically the most powerful non-nuclear bunker buster the U.S. has. Weighs almost 30,000 pounds. Think about that.
Huge.
And it's designed to penetrate really deep targets. We're talking 59 feet of reinforced concrete or 200 feet of earth.
So perfect for hitting something buried like Fordo.
Exactly why it was likely chosen. The Israelis couldn't reach it. The MOP is designed precisely for that kind of hard and deeply buried target.
And how do they deliver something that big?
Only one aircraft can currently do it. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. It can carry 2 MOPs at a time, and apparently it can drop them sequentially, one after the other, to burrow even deeper.
Wow, okay. And what about Isfahan? That wasn't hit with MOPs.
No, for Isfahan they mentioned Tomahawk cruise missiles, more than 24 fired from a U.S. submarine.
So a mix of heavy penetration bombs and precision cruise missiles. And the scale of the operation.
Pretty significant.
Yeah.
U.S. officials said 125 aircraft were involved overall, delivered 75 precision bombs.
125 aircraft. That's a major operation.
A huge covert operation. And they claimed, interestingly, that Iran didn't even detect the attack until it was over, until the bombers were gone. They called it the biggest B-2 operation in U.S. history.
And the first time the MOPs were actually used in combat.
First combat use, yes.
Okay, so we have this picture of immense power-deployed stealth bombers, massive bombs, the U.S. claiming spectacular success, obliteration. But there's always another side, isn't there? What's the story coming out of Iran?
And this is where it gets really complex, because right now, there's just no independent way to verify exactly what happened at those sites. Iran is telling a very different story.
What are they saying?
Well, you have Mehdi Mohammadi, an advisor linked to the parliament speaker. He basically said, yeah, we expected something like this. Fordo was evacuated beforehand. And crucially, no irreversible damage was sustained.
No irreversible damage. That's quite different from obliterated.
Worlds apart. And the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, the AEOI, they put out statements saying things like, no contamination recorded, no danger to residents, and work will not be stopped. They're vowing to continue development.
And the IAEA, did they weigh in?
Their chief, Grossi, confirmed they hadn't detected any increase in off-site radiation levels near the sites. He also said the IAEA would hold an emergency meeting on Monday to discuss the situation.
So no off-site radiation. That doesn't necessarily mean no damage on-site, though.
Exactly. It means no immediate radiological danger detected in the surrounding areas. Doesn't tell us about the state of the centrifuges or the buildings themselves.
This just highlights the challenge, doesn't it? For us, for anyone trying to understand this, you have these completely opposing narratives. Total destruction versus minimal damage. How do you even begin to figure out the truth?
You really can't, not immediately. And that's maybe the key point for you, the listener. In these high-stakes conflicts, verifying claims on the ground is incredibly difficult, sometimes impossible in the short term.
So the narrative itself becomes part of the conflict.
Precisely. It's strategic information warfare. Each side is trying to shape perception, justify their actions, and set the stage for what comes next. Understanding that dynamic is almost as important as knowing the ground truth, which we might not know for a while.
Okay, so given this fog of war, this clash of narratives, how has Iran officially reacted? What are they saying they'll do?
The reaction has been fierce, as you'd expect. Strong condemnation, clear threats. Their foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, he called the U.S. attack a grave violation of the UN Charter, international law, the NPT.
The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Right. He used words like outrageous, lawless, criminal behavior, and he stated very clearly, Iran reserves all options for self-defense.
And the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei.
He had actually warned the U.S. before the strikes against joining Israel's attacks. He said it would lead to irreparable consequences. Afterwards, he declared Iran will not surrender and will stand firm against an imposed war.
Strong words.
Very strong. The foreign ministry piled on, accusing the U.S. of betraying diplomacy, waging a dangerous war, and again, asserting Iran's right to resist U.S. military aggression.
So the rhetoric is clear, but what about actual retaliation? What are Iran's options, realistically, and what could the fallout be?
Well, analysts like Stephen Zunes have laid out some possibilities. Direct attacks on U.S. forces in the region, and remember, there are tens of thousands of U.S. personnel within range of Iranian missiles and drones.
That's a sobering thought.
It is. Another option. targeting the U.S. fleet in the Persian Gulf, that could have huge ripple effects on global shipping, oil prices. The whole global economy could feel that. Zunes also mentioned the possibility of Iran using proxy militias, say in Iraq, to target American bases.
And have they done anything yet?
They did act quickly. On Sunday, Iran launched attacks on Israel using one of its newer, more advanced missiles, the Khyber Shikan. So immediate military response towards Israel.
But the bigger threat maybe is related to the nuclear program itself, the NPT.
That's a really serious one. There's talk, highlighted by figures like Abbas Golru, who heads the parliament's Foreign Policy Committee, that Iran might withdraw from the NPT altogether.
Pull out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Exactly. Citing Article 10, which allows a country to withdraw if extraordinary events have jeopardized the supreme interests of its country. Pulling out of the NPT would be a massive step. It basically signals they no longer feel bound by international constraints on developing nuclear weapons.
Wow. Okay, so this isn't just a tit for tat anymore. This feels like it could set off something much bigger, a real escalation cycle.
That's the deep concern echoing everywhere right now. International bodies, analysts, they're worried. UN Chief Antonio Guterres said he was gravely alarmed.
He called it a dangerous escalation.
Yeah, a direct threat to international peace and security. He warned about the growing risk of this conflict getting rapidly out of control, with potentially catastrophic consequences.
And analysts.
Adam Weinstein at the Quincy Institute put it starkly. He warned the U.S. is now risking being dragged into a prolonged war in the Middle East.
How does he see it playing out?
He suggests Iran won't just stop its nuclear program. They'll likely continue it, maybe more secretly. They might leave the NPT, as we discussed. That, in turn, could lead to calls from Israel for even more strikes.
And Iran would likely retaliate.
Exactly. To preserve its own credibility, its regime legitimacy. And Weinstein concludes, basically, this is how the escalation cycle starts. He's very skeptical this will be just a one-off strike by the U.S.
And just to pour gasoline on the fire, President Trump has already issued more threats. Right?
He has, stating that any retaliation from Iran will be met with force far greater than what was witnessed tonight.
So you have these conflicting claims about what even happened in the first strikes, and simultaneously these really stark threats about what comes next. It feels like a critical moment.
Absolutely. How do these actions, based on contested results, reshape the entire region? Reshape global stability? That's the enormous question hanging in the balance right now.
So, to recap our deep dive today, we looked at the specifics of the U.S. strikes on Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. We examined the powerful weapons used, like the MOP bunker busters.
We contrasted the U.S. claims of total obliteration with Iran's narrative of advanced evacuation and no irreversible damage.
Right. We heard Iran's defiant condemnations, their threats of retaliation, including possibly leaving the NPT.
And we heard the serious warnings from the UN and analysts about a dangerous escalation cycle, a potential prolonged conflict.
It leaves you thinking about what the immediate future holds, doesn't it? The weight of these events feels really heavy.
It does. And maybe a final thought for you to consider, building on everything we've discussed. Given these completely opposite claims, total destruction versus minimal impact, what might be the real long-term effect on Iran's actual nuclear capabilities? And maybe more importantly, how does this whole episode change the rules of the game, the calculus for war and diplomacy in the Middle East, as everyone now holds their breath, watching for the next move?
News Talk on Samar News, your go-to podcast for the latest headlines and in-depth discussions. Join us as we unravel the stories that matter most, bringing you insightful commentary and expert analysis. Tune in for thought-provoking conversations that spark dialogue and inspire action. Stay connected with the news that shapes our world, only on News Talk on Samar News.